Special thank you to my patrons for both helping make this video happen and providing today's topic. 2024 has been one strange season. Indiana's in the top 10 and in all likelihood making the playoffs. Vanderbilt beat number 1 Alabama, and Iowa State is playing for a Big 12 title and their own playoff berth. Traditionally underperforming programs from across the nation are having breakout seasons, some quite literally unlike anything they've ever experienced. Yet to fully grasp the importance of some of these teams, we need to look in depth at these programs and all the years that preceded them. We begin in the heart of the Midwest. Of the 16 current members of the new-look Big 12, 7 were members of the original Big 12 formed in 1996. And of those 7, Iowa State has traditionally been the worst, having the worst winning percentage in the conference and 4th worst winning percentage among current Power 4 programs. They'd begin their football journey as an independent, amassing a number of successful seasons under the tutelage of famed head coach Pop Warner, before joining the Old Missouri Valley Intercollegiate Athletic Association, alongside the likes of Nebraska, the Kansas schools, the Oklahoma schools, and other Midwest programs. It's here where they again found success, winning the conference in 1911 and 1912. These would be the last conference titles Iowa State would win as of 2024. Soon after the Missouri Valley split, the smaller schools went on to form a new-look Missouri Valley Conference, while the larger brands, including Iowa State, left to form the Big Six. It's here where Iowa State, one of the smallest universities in the new centralized conference, would struggle. From the creation of the Big Six in 1928 to 1942, the Cyclones amassed a total of 4 winning seasons and 11 losing seasons, never finishing ranked, never reaching a bowl, and going winless for the first time in 1930. It'd take until the 70s for Iowa State to begin resembling a winning program, finally making their first bowl game in 1971. The 70s would encapsulate some of Iowa State's best seasons, reaching the postseason 4 times throughout the decade and finishing ranked for the very first time in school history in 1976, notching ranked wins over Missouri and Nebraska through the nation's 3rd highest scoring offense. This period of success would come to an abrupt end, however, as the 80s began, beginning Iowa State's worst ever stretch of football. It began with new head coach Jim Kreiner. Fresh off an FCS national championship run with Boise State, Kreiner was brought in to, hopefully, carry on the momentum the program had in the 70s and early 80s. He did not. Instead, he had his program probed by the NCAA for rule violations. He played a quarterback who, months earlier, confessed to assault. He'd kick a star wide receiver off the team for, quote, disciplinary reasons, to then kick another star wide receiver off the team for the same reasons, causing a massive public scandal that had his suspension shortened, to then suspend him again the following season, to then go back and let him rejoin anyways. It was a circus that eventually led to Kreiner's firing and a forced scholarship reduction by the NCAA, digging the Cyclones into a hole they wouldn't get out of for years. From 1982 to 1999, Iowa State would notch a total of 2 winning seasons, with no bowl appearances and not a single week spent in the AP poll. Beginning in the year 2000, though, Iowa State would begin their steady climb to where they are today. They'd go 9-3, the most wins in a season in program history, while finishing ranked for the 2nd time ever and winning their first bowl game against Pittsburgh. These accomplishments would all be under head coach Dan McCarney's tenure, who would go on to bring Iowa State 4 more bowls and a shared Big 12 North title in 2004. Since McCarney's tenure, outside of a rough start to the 2010s, Iowa State has been on the rise. Since 2016, the Cyclones under Matt Campbell have only notched 2 losing seasons, made 6 bowl games, and finished in the AP Top 10 for the first and only time in history in 2020, going on to make and win the Fiesta Bowl with 2022's Mr. Irrelevant Brock Purdy. From Ames, Iowa, we go south to the SEC's perennial punching bag. Coming in with the 8th worst winning percentage among current Power 4 teams, the Vanderbilt Commodores have entrenched themselves over the past half-century as the SEC's worst football program. However, it was not always that way. I've talked a bit about Vanderbilt's early history in my previous video, but to summarize, Vanderbilt's early football history was defined by Hall of Fame head coach Dan McGugin, who coached the Commodores from 1904 to 1934. In that time, Vandy went undefeated 4 separate times, won 14 conference titles, 12 with the Southern Intercollegiate Athletic Association and 2 with the Southern Conference, won 6 unrecognized national titles, fielded 4 of Vandy's 5 Hall of Fame players, 3 of Vandy's 7 consensus All-Americans, and beat a number of college football's most prestigious programs at the time along the way. And then, the SEC was formed. Consisting of 13 former Southern Conference members, Vanderbilt would begin to decline in their new, more centralized conference. Yet they still proved very competitive. Their early SEC seasons would be defined by a pair of former Vandy players turned Hall of Fame head coaches, McGugin's direct successor Ray Morrison and Henry "Red" Sanders. Both would keep Vanderbilt above 500 and in the AP poll, finishing as high as 12th in the AP poll in 1948. 7 years later, the Commodores would make their very first bowl game, defeating a top 10 Auburn in the Gator Bowl. And then, Vanderbilt would fall off a cliff. From 1902 to 1960, 58 years, Vanderbilt had 7 total losing seasons. And from 1961 to 2023, the past 62 years, Vanderbilt has 7 winning seasons, with a particularly horrible stretch from 1983 to 2007, where Vanderbilt each and every year would fail to reach 500. It's a night and day difference, a direct consequence of a host of changes to the sport throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The elimination of mandatory two-way players, and by extension the legalization of specialized positions, would prioritize large, talented, and deep rosters, working hand-in-hand with roster expansions throughout the 70s and 80s to ensure smaller programs, especially smaller Power 4 programs, couldn't compete on a regular basis. It's these changes, alongside sweeping media rights reforms in the wake of NCAA versus Oklahoma, and Vanderbilt's own stringent academic standards that send the Commodores into a death spiral they still, to this day, haven't truly escaped. The spiral would briefly come to an end, though, in the early 2010s under head coach James Franklin, finishing ranked for the first time since Red Sanders coached the program in 2012 and 2013, going 9-4 in both seasons. And then Franklin left for Penn State, and Vanderbilt would slip back into the SEC's basement until, well, now. Vanderbilt under head coach Clark Lee and New Mexico State legends Diego Pavia and Jerry Kill are in almost unprecedented form. Winning their home opener against Virginia Tech, the 2024 Commodores would go on to upset the #1 Alabama Crimson Tide, their very first win over an AP #1 in program history. It, alongside First Bank Stadium's very visible renovations, are signs that Vanderbilt's athletic department is, finally, investing significantly in their football program. Now, it remains to be seen whether or not a consistent winner can be built at Vanderbilt, but for the time being, from Nashville, we go out west to find our next bottom feeder, in the remains of what was once the Conference of Champions. Coming in with the worst winning percentage of the old Pac-12 and 7th worst winning percentage among 2023's Power 5 are the Oregon State Beavers. But surprisingly, you wouldn't know it looking at 2/3 of their history. Oregon State founded their football program in 1893, bouncing between an early All-Oregon Conference and independence before founding the PCC. The Oregons would spend their early PCC years as a solidly middle-of-the-pack team, constantly around 500 until about 1941, when Oregon State out of nowhere, won the PCC for the very first time in program history, earning their very first Rose Bowl berth in the process. Except, the Beavers' Rose Bowl would not be in the Rose Bowl. A little under a month before they were set to face the Duke Blue Devils in Pasadena, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, forcing college football's oldest bowl game for the first time to leave California for Durham, North Carolina. It's a game the Beavers would miraculously win, upsetting the number 2 Blue Devils on their home field to cap off their Cinderella run. It'd take over a decade for Oregon State to win their next conference title, bouncing back from a 5-year losing season skid to start the 50s to make the Rose Bowl again in 1956 off a 7-2-1 record, this time getting to play in the actual Rose Bowl. Their 56 run to Pasadena would kick off one of Beaver football's most successful eras, an era that, unfortunately, coincided with the death of their conference. Under the weight of scandal and big market mutinies, the Pacific Coast Conference, the West Coast's first football conference, dissolved in 1958, laying the groundwork for the eventual birth of the Pac-8 10 years later. In between the end of the PCC and birth of the Pac, though, was the AAWU, a conference consisting of San Francisco, LA, and Seattle, the West's largest brands, and no one else. Idaho, Oregon, Washington State, and Oregon State were left behind as independents. Despite this terrible situation, the Beavers would continue to play great football, headlined by their 1962 campaign when they finished 9-2, won the Liberty Bowl, and fielded the program's one and only Heisman and quarterback Terry Baker. It's through this play that Oregon State would find their way into the AAWU, joining alongside Castaways Oregon and Washington State to form the nucleus of what would eventually be the Pac-8. Oregon State's run would continue into their new conference, winning it their very first year in 1964 and making their third ever Rose Bowl in the process. The future looked bright in Corvallis. And then, the 70s hit. 1971 would be the beginning of the streak, a 28-year-long skid where Oregon State never finished above 500. Most years, they never even really got close. 1 winless season in 1980, 8 1-win seasons, 8 more 2-win seasons, culminating in a .210 winning percentage from 1971 to 1999. By far the worst in college football. It's a streak so bad that it almost single-handedly makes Oregon State the worst program by winning percentage in the old Pac-12 by a fairly wide margin. Notable events from their abysmal 28-year-long run include a miraculous 1978 upset of a top 10 UCLA, a trip to Tokyo's Mirage Bowl in 1980 to then get destroyed by another UCLA team, a league-wide academic scandal, also in 1980, that saw the NCAA come down on Oregon State alongside half of the Pac-10, and the infamous Toilet Bowl, played in 1983 between a 2-8 Oregon State and a 4-6 Oregon, in a storm that brought down an oil tanker earlier that day. The Civil War rivals would quote-unquote battle each other to a scoreless tie. The last such game in college football history. Oregon State, after spending a quarter of a century in turmoil, would eventually turn to Dennis Erickson to fix Beaver football. Before his extremely successful tenure at Miami and less extremely successful tenure at Seattle, Erickson was a program miracle worker, bringing Idaho and Washington State's football teams back from the dead. And in 1999, against all odds, he did it again. 7-5, a bowl berth, and one of the worst stretches of football ever played set to rest. What more could a team ask for? Well, how about an 11-1 2000, their first double-digit win season as a program, all tied in with a share of the Pac-10 title and a dominant win over Notre Dame in the Fiesta Bowl. Since their breakout seasons, Oregon State has largely returned to where they were before the streak, consistently at or above 500, in and out of the polls, existing as a respectable Pac-10 and eventually Pac-12 member, outside of a rough losing season stretch in the 2010s. Today, the Beavers find themselves in largely the same spot they were all the way back in 1958, playing respectable football to be rewarded with the collapse of their conference. yet again being cast to the side in favor of the West's larger brands. Whether or not Oregon State will be able to return to a major conference or build one anew remains to be seen, but thankfully for the Beavers of Corvallis, they're no stranger to this kind of adversity. For our next program, we return to the southeast to find Tobacco Road's weakest link. The Wake Forest Demon Deacons are known for a number of things. They play in the Power Four's smallest stadium. They're named after a town they aren't actually in, and they hold not only the worst winning percentage in the ACC, but the worst among all major programs. The losing would start early, compiling only 4 winning seasons their first 34 years of existence. Yet, after 1922, the young Demon Deacons would begin to get their feet under them, hovering around 500 for much of the next 2 decades. Wake Forest's first run of consistently good football would come in the late 30s and last until the early 50s, a period comprising the coaching career of Deacon great D.C. Walker, a coach that, to this day, holds the Wake Forest record for overall wins. His efforts would bring the program into the AP poll for the very first time in 1944, with the Deacons finishing ranked for the first time the following year. Walker's tenure would also see the program's first postseason appearances, making the Gator and Dixie Bowls in 45 and 48 respectively. And then Walker left for the CFL, and Wake Forest was left to wander for half a century. From 1950 to the year 2000, Wake Forest had 13 winning seasons and played in a whopping 3 bowl games. Through a combination of consistent coaching turnover, the numerous expansions of the ACC, and simply being major college football's smallest brand, the Deacons would struggle to find any consistent success. There would still be highlights, of course. In 1970, they'd win the ACC for the very first time off a 6-5 record, to then get passed up by runner-up North Carolina to play in the Peach Bowl. In 1976, they'd field their first consensus All-American and defensive back Bill Armstrong, and in 92, they'd finish ranked number 25 with a win over Oregon in the Independence Bowl. Besides these brief respites, Wake Forest was lost, to then be found by Jim Grobe. Starting slow with a 2-9 2000s, the Deacons would finally, after 50 years, find consistent success, reaching their peak in 2006. In a season so miraculous an entire film was made to commemorate it, Wake Forest would go a staggering 11-3, their first double-digit win season in program history. They'd also win the ACC for the second time ever off a 9-6 victory over Georgia Tech, and punch a ticket to their very first BCS Bowl, the Orange Bowl. It would end up being the highlight of Grobe's tenure in Winston-Salem, with the Deacons slowly declining until Grobe's resignation in 2013. It seemed, for a bit at least, that Wake Forest would slip back into the punching bag it had always been. But then, something strange happened. In a scandal that honestly deserves its own video, a disgruntled former Wake Forest staffer would leak first-year Deacon head coach Dave Clawson's playbook to their ACC opponents, with the scheme eventually being uncovered in 2016. What's odd about the, quote, WikiLeaks scandal, though, was its immensely positive effects it had on the Wake Forest program. Clawson was forced to lock down the media's access to practices, his offensive coordinator was forced to rewrite his scheme from the ground up, and both propelled Wake Forest to a level of success that overshadowed even the 2000s. They'd earned 4 straight winning seasons for the first time since the 40s, punch a ticket to 7 bowl games, and even climbed back to the 11-win mark for the second time in program history in 2021. And every year since WikiLeaks, the Deacons have fielded an offense in the top half of the nation in scoring. Which brings us to today. Winston-Salem is reeling from its first back-to-back losing season since the scandal, with both seasons' offenses ranking among the nation's worst. The reforms that brought new life into the Deacons seems to be losing their luster, and time will tell whether or not Clawson will be able to adapt and keep winning at one of college football's hardest places to win. Wake Forest may have the distinction of college football's worst winning percentage, but they do not claim the title for most losses. For that, we have to travel up north to our last conference bottom feeder. Indiana, since founding its football program in 1887, has amassed 713 losses, the most in Division I college football. No major program who's been around this long has ever lost as consistently as the Hoosiers. Throughout their 137 years of operation, they've amassed a total of 7 seasons where they finished in the AP poll. To put that in perspective, the program has 3 more seasons where they notched a single win on their schedule. 3 more seasons placing as college football's absolute worst than within its upper fourth. Their first brush with national football relevance would come in 1945, going undefeated for the first and last time in program history with a 9-0-1 record, simultaneously winning the Big Ten, then called the Western Conference, for the first time. Through a Hall of Fame halfback tandem in George Taliaferro and Pete Pijos, the 45 Hoosiers would rocket all the way to 4th in the polls, to then be passed by the number 3 Crimson Tide for the right to play in the Rose Bowl. The team would regress the following year with a 6-3 record, a record still good for 20th in the nation, ensuring Indiana finished ranked in back-to-back seasons for the first and only time in program history. Their next shot at Pasadena would come in 1967, winning the Big Ten for the second, and as of writing this video, last time off a 6-1 conference record and a win over their rivals, the number 3 Purdue Boilermakers, to clinch their first ever Rose Bowl. They'd eventually fall 14-3 to O.J. Simpson and the USC Trojans. Their 4th ranked finish would come a little over a decade after their Rose Bowl in 1979, in what ended up being the best season of Indiana head coach Lee Corso's tenure in Bloomington. The Hoosiers would lean on Big Ten MVP quarterback Tim Clifford to finish the regular season 7-4, punching a ticket to the Holiday Bowl. Waiting for them were the 11-0 BYU Cougars, boasting the highest scoring offense in the nation, prepared for their first undefeated season in program history. That final win, however, would never come, as Corso's Indiana upset BYU 38-37 and finished ranked at 19. 9 years later would come another Indiana head coach's high watermark. Bill Mallory, despite starting off his tenure with Indiana's first and only winless season, would develop into one of the most consistent winners in modern Hoosier football history, putting together 7 winning seasons across his 12 seasons in Bloomington, with his best coming in 1988. Much like Lee Corso's best season, Mallory's 1988 squad would finish the regular season with a solid 7-3-1 record, fielding another Big Ten Offensive Player of the Year, this time running back Anthony Thompson, to then earn a berth in the Liberty Bowl against South Carolina, going on to win themselves a number 20 ranking in the final AP poll. 8 years later, and Mallory would be fired after a 13-game losing streak, plunging Indiana back to the depths of Big Ten football. From 1995 to 2018, the Hoosiers would notch a single winning season, by far their worst stretch of football in their long, already troubled history. Then came the fever dream of a season that was 2020. Through the play of multi-year Heisman finalist and future Atlanta Falcon legend Michael Penix Jr., the Hoosiers would dominate their COVID conference slate, losing a single game to Ohio State to finish the regular season 6-1, earning a berth in the Outback Bowl, where they eventually fell to a 4-5 Ole Miss, still finishing ranked number 12 in the final polls, their final ranked season. Until, of course, this year. 11-1 as of writing this video, their first double-digit winning record ever, their first 10-0 start ever, their 4th ever appearance in the AP Top 10, all with a berth in the first 12-team college football playoffs. So much has been said of Cignetti's turnaround in Bloomington, but what's truly fascinating is its connection to the rest of college football's, quote, bottom feeders. Whether it's Vanderbilt, Wake Forest, Oregon State, Iowa State, Duke, UNLV, or a number of other perennial underachievers, they're all seeing unprecedented recent success, with this year alone featuring a number of all-time best performances. It's still too soon to declare a trend, but in the midst of the facilities race ending, the establishment of the NIL system, and the shrinking of roster limits, it feels, to me at least, like the end of an era. An era of 10 to 15 programs taking turns assembling super teams, and the end of an era of perennial hapless bottom feeders. Top programs simply can't hoard talent like they used to the benefit of all the teams under them, which could explain the recent unprecedented success stories found all over the college football landscape. Is it sustainable? Only time can tell. But in the meantime, catch some Indiana football, or watch highlights of Vanderbilt's upset over Alabama. It's not every year you get the opportunity to see something that's quite literally never been done before. Firstly, I'd like to apologize for the delay this video has had. It's been a pretty busy month for me in general, and the next project shouldn't take nearly this long. Secondly, I'd like to, again, thank my patrons. Captain Coey, the King of War 541, William L. Jagnow, Aiden Wong, Yeah Avenue, Ryan Liu, Authentic Sims, Max Kern, Joe Sports 2022, Lance Justice, Class Jackson Lawsuit, Hoppe, October Rust 02, Justin Pedraza, Cole, Nick Knudsen, Lurker, Trash Can Gus, Ease.L, Spicy Bape, The Erupturatan, Adrian Genge, Deatheros, Sean McWilliams, CC, The Hidden Source, Bradley Moore, at Signwood, Scarface 1, Mega Doomer, Philip, and Crosley Jones. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see y'all in the next video.